Fantastic. Okay, so I will go ahead and get started. So first, I would just like to thank everyone for being here, and particularly thank the Symphonic Student Association. Uh, I am just so thrilled that you are putting on this series. Even during the school year, since you began, you have been just a wonderful presence on campus to help organize community events and bringing people together and just, promoting uh, this just a community of people that enjoy making music together. And so during these very difficult times, I am just amazed and grateful that you have stepped up and continued that process through online. And this is just one of the best things that I think are happening. And the lineup you have of people coming after me, from Celeste to Kier to Stephen Schick, is really impressive. So this is awesome. So again, just thank you for having me. This is I'm really honored to be here, and this is going to be a lot of fun. Just before I begin, just a few notes about me. Most of you know me as the conductor of the UCSD Chamber Orchestra, and that's kind of been my day-to-day job for the last couple of years. But beyond that, I have been getting my doctorate at UCSD in double bass performance, particularly with an emphasis on experimental and contemporary music, which is what our department is known for. And that's been a focus of my life and what I continue to do. So this lecture, a lot of it is going to just be talking about things I've done in the past, but I'd like to hopefully create some kind of narrative and show some aspects that maybe all of you can gain from and get something out of. And I want to highlight maybe different activities I've been a part of, but also how maybe you can get involved with making new music, working with composers, doing things. And I'd like to have it be something that you can draw from, instead of some guy standing up here talking about Carole Baskin for 5 hours. It needs to have, I'd like, there to be a point to it. So this lecture, the things I'd like you to think about as you're listening to it and you hear all these different pieces is, one, hopefully I just introduce you to new music. That this is going, I'm 99% positive this is going to be music that you've never heard before, and it kind of goes outside of what your normal listening experiences and anything you'd consider mainstream. And so I hope I introduce you into a new way of hearing music and just new music itself, and realize there's a large community of composers, performers, improvisers, artists that just engage in something we call avant-garde or experimental music. And this is a wonderful community that is not really defined by any particular sound or genre, but it's just the act of wanting to create something new. So I hope I just kind of point you in that direction. The second thing is, a big part of my life is I work with composers. That's really kind of been a huge part of what it means to make music, and to be a part of a community of musicians, is to work with composers. And I've written music for people have written music for me. I've jointly composed music with composers. This is something that is just a wonderful experience for me. And so I hope just showing you some of the composers I've worked with that maybe inspires you in the future to go out and maybe work with some composers, particularly at UCSD. This is a center for new music, and there are tons and tons and tons of composers walking around that would love to work with performers, and vice versa. So I hope this is something that inspires you. The last thing is just as something to think about, maybe potentially writing music. I think there's a misconception that you have to be trained or specialized to compose music, and this is not the case. Especially if you're just doing it for yourself, it can be similar to writing poetry or painting or journaling. When you write music, it doesn't have to be for anybody, and it can be a process that is very just wonderful and healing. And especially during this time in quarantine, it can be something that has nothing to do with productivity, but something that is just an enjoyable act. Great. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is going to go back in time and talk about my work individually as a composer. And I'd like to start with it because it actually led to different opportunities with me working with other composers based on my origins as a composer. So I started composing at a fairly young age and continued on through high school, and was very fortunate to go to a performing arts high school where I worked with lots of different composers, and we had a composition club where we would just perform each other's music, and it was a very that was a wonderful time for me. And then I went on to college, and I actually declared my major as a composition major, even though it technically was really a double major in bass performance and composition. But that's what I was doing, and I just kept composing, and this really solidified my love for new music and working on creating new things. And so while I was at Baylor, it was during my, I'd been writing music, and especially for the double bass, I found that the double bass is a very interesting instrument in that it does not have a past repertoire to draw from. I mean, it does a little bit, but they're very few and far between, these kind of outliers that exist. And in my opinion, a lot of them are just imitating other pieces. And it doesn't really have its own solo repertoire. It's mainly known as a reinforcement as an orchestral instrument. And so, you know, and I'm working with a lot of the performers right now in 95E, and they're, you know, the violinists and cellists and pianists are sending me these works, and every time I look at it, you know, like I'm working on a Bach sonata with someone, and I just look at it and go, do you know how lucky you are to have a piece like this? This music is unbelievable. We don't have anything even remotely close to this on just the depth and the complexity and just overall experience of it. You know, it's as fine a piece as the Kusevitsky bass concerto is, it is not a Bach sonata on any level. It really is not. And so, you know, growing up, I would play these pieces on bass and thinking we don't have a repertoire. And so this is a kind of blessing and curse in that one of the ways I, you know, approach the bass was, this is an instrument that has not been defined. It does not have a particular sound, where when you look at the Beethoven piano sonatas, the Bach sonatas, these really defined what the instrument would become in the 20th century. It really shaped it, even evolved. You know, Beethoven used pedal, so they made more pianos with pedal. And these things kind of went through an instrumental evolution, where the double bass, it's very strange how it evolved. And so actually, when I think about my own sound, it kind of was self-created. I do certain things on the bass that I consider, this is just how I play, and I don't try to base it off anybody else. And I developed this through composition, and I kind of feel lucky that I don't have this baggage of looking about, like, this is how I'm supposed to sound. I just kind of invented it myself. So I was writing a lot of music for the double bass, and when I was in undergrad, I had a wonderful teacher. His name is Sandor Osland, incredible bass player, just absolute virtuoso, and wonderful teacher. And so he commissioned work for me for double bass and percussion with the percussionist Todd Meehan. And so I wrote this piece in I believe it was 2011. I was living in Paris at the time, studying with another bassist. And I wrote this piece with just kind of, but it's important to know that I wrote it at the instrument. You know, as a double bassist, this entire vocabulary of this piece came out of me trying to create a new vocabulary that wasn't, you know, Beethoven 5 scherzo and trio, which seems to be mostly what we do half the time. And so I would explore different sounds and really try to create this new vocabulary that was that had its own logic, that it had its own path, its own feeling. And then with the percussion, I was able to kind of mess around creating this meta instrument where it wasn't really a bass, it wasn't a percussion, but they coalesced to create this one just mega instrument that that keeps reinforcing each other. So I'm going to play a recording of this piece. It's titled Leap of Faith, and it's 3 movements long. The first 2 just kind of go into each other. The first is really just kind of a introduction of the material that will come in through each movement. And then it goes into the second movement. And for the first 2 movements, I was very interested in defining what it means to play a resonant instrument and really expand the sound and the timbre and just keep reinforcing new overtones that will make the instrument bigger. And there's obviously kind of a compositional logic to it, introduce these 3 themes, and then that gets climaxed in the second movement. And then the third movement is much more short and tight and has this rhythmic groove that propels it to the end. Great, so I'm going to play this piece right now. I highly recommend everyone use headphones if you can. If you have headphones, that would be very nice. It's just, it works better when you're listening through headphones than coming out of the Mac computer screen. Obviously,
by the way, Matt.
Yep.
Zoom only plays audio in mono.
In mono.
So any stereo panning effects will be summed to mono.
Okay, that's okay. Great, I'll give you 2 seconds, but trying to think of anything else. Great, and this was a wonderful experience for me for really trying to really create this new sound for this instrument that I was looking for. And even though this is a very early piece for me, it was an important piece for later projects. Great, so here is Leap of Faith, performed by Sandor Oslin and Todd Meehan. Oops, sorry about that. Give me 2 seconds. I totally skipped 3 steps and went ahead. Give me 2 seconds. Share screen, share computer sound. Now we are ready. Okay, sorry about that. One more time. There we go. Great. So that was Leap of Faith. Just to let you know, I'm going to keep talking for a little bit, but at the end, hopefully, if you're able to stay around, I'll just allow time for questions in case there's anything you'd like to ask. But I'll move on to the next part of the presentation, which is a very important composer to me. His name is Krzysztof Penderecki. He is a name you may or may not know, whether through just hearing his name or maybe if you are familiar with his music as a whole. But Krzysztof Penderecki actually just recently died. It's very sad. He died on, right here, March 29th, so less than a month ago. And Penderecki is one of the most important composers that really defined the entire second half of the 20th century. He's a Polish composer, and right after World War II, you had, especially in Europe, you had a whole generation of composers that were very, almost with an urgency, trying to create a completely different sound and aesthetic and approach to music. And a large part of this had to do with the horrors that happened in World War II. There's almost a necessity to move away from any kind of art, music, literature that had any aspect of nationalism attached to it. They did not want any type of and part of this has to do with kind of the intensity that Germany at the time was surrounding itself with the music of Beethoven, of Wagner, of Bruckner, of Strauss. Some of it legitimate, some of it was very unfair, and there's a lot of, it's a complex subject, I'll just say that. But composers right after this were really moving towards something, and this is really when you get the first hints of what we call, modern day experimental and avant-garde music. They wanted to totally define a new sound that was, separate from tonality, from just form, and lots of different approaches that were the norm in Western music up until that point. And so in Western Europe, you had composers like Pierre Boulez and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, but Penderecki was in Poland, and he was actually kind of removed from a lot of what was happening in Europe because it was still under the Iron Curtain, and he had very limited access to the outside. And so he was creating these just gigantic experimental works, and that are, still to this day are, to my ears, are still absolutely crazy and bonkers when you listen to it. For me, if you want to introduce someone to new music, I think there's no better piece to put on than either Penderecki's Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima or Polymorphia. And these works, whether you like them or not, there is just this immediate visceral nature and this kind of shock factor that comes out of it. And you could say, I absolutely hate this, but I get that this is intense. This is something that will just slam you against the wall. It's amazing. And, I have the score right here. You can see that he's, really messing around with different forms of notation. This is this kind of, this totally what we call graphic notation. It doesn't define any pitches, but it gives you this range of sound that's occurring. And if you're interested, I would highly recommend checking out some of this. He actually, one CD that's a really interesting album to check out is about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, he actually did a joint project with Johnny Greenwood, who is the lead guitarist for Radiohead. And he, Johnny said, Penderecki was his favorite composer ever. And so he approached him, and they did this album together where they recorded, Threnody and Polymorphia, but then they also recorded two of Johnny Greenwood's pieces, which were responses to these pieces. And you can hear influences. And so, what was I saying? Anyway, give me 2 seconds. Yeah. Sorry about that. Where was I with my notes? Anyway, so, and the other thing I would recommend checking out is another person who was a big fan of Penderecki's music, was David Lynch. And actually a lot of film composers. You might have heard his music through the music of Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick used it in The Shining and I believe 2001: A Space Odyssey. This was actually without his consent. He had no idea it was being used, but this is what people remember him for. So that's history. And but David Lynch, if any of you are interested in the show Twin Peaks, the kind of center of the latest season he came out with, episode 8, has to do with the atomic bomb going off and kind of the introduction of all evil. And it's this almost giant, like, art film that goes on for a long time. And they play through the victims of Hiroshima. And it's a really, really surreal and crazy experience to go through. So I highly recommend that. That's episode 8, if you want to check that out. But with Penderecki, I was very lucky to get to work with him. Right at the end of undergrad, I participated in a festival called the, what was it called? I have it written right here. The Music Academy Westfalen. And I went and I performed with an orchestra and was the principal double bassist for this orchestra that toured around Europe. And he was the conductor. And we played through some of his works. The first time we did a big performance of his Second Symphony, which was a very defining period for him. He has two radically different styles that defined his life. From about 1959 to about 1980 is what his most avant-garde and experimental music. And then right around 1980, he just decided, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to write something totally different. And so he started composing music that sounds, for most people's ear, it sounds very, very close to Shostakovich. Like you could swear you're listening to a Shostakovich symphony, just maybe slightly more dissonant, but it's very close. The music I'm going to be focusing on is the earlier stuff, but that later music is out there, and it's very interesting. So when I was playing in this orchestra, I approached him, and I thought, I'm never going to have a chance to, be around this composer again. So I approached him and I said, would it be okay if we had a meeting and I could just show you some of my compositions? And he was very gracious. And so we met, and I actually played through him a solo version of the piece I just played for you, as well as another piece by me. And he was very generous and very excited. And he gave me the biggest compliment ever, which was, he said, I had no idea the double bass could ever make these sounds, which for me was just, I nearly had a heart attack, because this is the composer, that I looked up to my whole life, who does nothing but invent sounds. So that was a very exciting moment for me. And so I played it for him. We had a long conversation, and then a couple days went by, and he came up to me and he said, would you be interested in doing a project with me? I would really like to see what happens if you try to perform a piece I wrote in 1968 on the double bass. And he said, I understand it was not written for it, but I think it could actually work well, if not better, on this instrument if you just kind of tweaked it and reworked it for this instrument. And so I went home and spent over a year working on this. It was a very difficult project. And the piece is it's written for solo cello. It's titled Capriccio per Siegfried Palm, which was written for the famous 20th century cellist Siegfried Palm. And so I went home and I worked on it, and eventually was able to kind of come up with something that I felt was really good. And then I went back the following year and played with him in this orchestra again. And we had a lot of sessions where we went back and forth and said, no, this works. No, this works better. Okay. And so it was an interesting project where he wasn't writing a piece for me, but we were jointly kind of taking this material and molding it into something that works for the instrument. So it was half orchestration and half composition, half performance. There was this very interesting kind of set of parameters that we were going through. And it was a very interesting process where I would take sounds that, I knew could just be exaggerated on the double bass for its size, or I would take a sound that I knew could never be done on the instrument and find a sound that would be close to it, or kind of give a similar sense of color that he was going for. So it's a good example is there's a part in the piece where the cellist has to reach over the bridge and start playing all these pitches behind the bridge. Well, as a double bass player, the arm length is too much. You literally can't do that unless you put your arm around the bass and you do something like this. But that takes at least 2 or 3 seconds to do. And I've kind of thrown at my back trying to do that. It's not safe, I'll just say that. And so I was like, okay, well, this is not going to work because you have to do it like that. I just go, it's just really, really, really fast. And so what I did was I found a sound where you bow next to the nut of your instrument and you start, it's above your left hand, and it gets a similar kind of squeaky sound. And so I would go through the piece just reworking sounds like this just to make it work for the instrument. And that was the process. And then about a month or two ago, this my score that I came up with got published through Schott Publishing, which was very exciting. So I'm going to play you this adaptation of that I did, and this is me performing in Italy, I believe, at the Soundscape Festival. So I hope you enjoy this. Oh, whoops. Let me get this. Sorry about this. Share screen. That's great. Okay, here it is. There's one thing I'm curious if any of you see. There is one fingering that is impossible to do on the bass. Because of the harmonic structure, it's a minor ninth in the lowest register, and there's no way the hand can even come close to that bridge. And then you have to glissando that minor ninth up. And so the only way I was able to do it is by putting the side of my head on the bass. And so you'll see this fingering where I'm playing an F with my forehead temple and fingering at the highest register. It's you get the sound, but it's very painful. But you know, that's what you have to do. All right, here it is. Oops, sorry about that. Great. Okay, so that was Penderecki. Great. So we don't have too much time, but I'd like to just get through the last part of my presentation. So we might go a little bit over too. So just even if you have to leave, that's okay. But just we're at the last part, which is kind of the work that I'm very interested in right now and present day 2020, which is there's a composer that I work with quite a lot. Her name is Eva-Maria Houben. She is a composer who lives in Germany, actually also in the Westfalen area around Dusseldorf. And she has been just absolutely one of the most influential artists in my life, and maybe ever. I am totally obsessed and in love with her music, and really grateful to have this collaboration with her. She is part of a musical kind of organization or group of artists that work together called the Wandelweiser group. And this is a group that consists of composers like Jörg Frey, Antoine Beuger, Manfred Werder, and actually, if you went to the last La Jolla Symphony concert, Michael Pissarro is also part of this. And so that might give you a hint of reference of kind of the style. And these are all composers that if you were to ask them what Wandelweiser is, they would probably all have completely different answers. And so it's not very dogmatic. It's just they tend to do certain things that they're sympathetic with each other and like to perform each other's music. Early on in the 90s, when it was founded by Antoine Beuger, they were particularly interested in the concept of silence and how silence can be integrated into music. This is loosely coming from, I pulled it out from John Cage's 433. But loosely, silence is a massive concept, and so some of the early pieces that they would write were very extreme. You know, Antoine Beuger would have pieces that go for 9+ hours, and you would make one tiny sound every 30 minutes, and it would, you know, it's just these massive events that are totally go beyond what you would call concert music. Their recent music, although still long, except for maybe Manfred Werder, they've kind of each gone in their own way and developed new ideas. But one thing that they tend to have in common is that, you know, their music tends to be very quiet. Most of them never, ever write a crescendo. This is a very interesting fact that, you know, I think Eva-Maria Houben, she's published about 339 works right now. And if you go through them, I can find about 2 pieces that she ever wrote a crescendo, which that's kind of a significant thing. And they tend towards something what you would call the monochromatic tone, which is a very pure, straight tone that helps define its relationship among other sounds and silence itself. But instead of just with the limited time, I'm just going to read two different passages just to kind of give you a sense of what she's talking about. It's really hard to say anything without coming off as dogmatic, and that's the last thing I'd like to do. So with let me see, here it is. This is a lecture that comes from a lecture that she gave in, I believe, well, is it 2007? Either that or I don't know. It was somewhere around 10 years ago, but here's just a passage. She writes, "And if you would ask me for a statement to composing, to my composing, I would answer, listening becomes the awareness of fading sound. Fading sound is the link between life and art, between perception in daily life and perception while performing, while composing. And the awareness of fading sound may become the awareness of presence." So she usually talks very poetically, and it's a very interesting working with her because she's written me about 4 pieces now, and sadly, next month I was supposed to give my final recital for my doctorate, but can't do that obviously now, and working towards it. But I was going to be premiering a work by her for solo bass that is about an hour and a half long. It's this massive work, and part of why I wanted it is, for me, every other instrument, you know, piano, violin, they all have works that really test size and and duration. But the double bass, this was not something that there was much repertoire that I could draw from, and I really wanted something that was an entity itself and you could explore for a long period of time. So I asked her to write me a piece, and it's a very special piece. I'm going to be playing something else, but I just wanted to give you an idea that, you know, when she composes for Peace People, it's a very special thing. She's not really thinking of writing a piece that is going to be, you know, displayed to the masses, and that this is this big thing that, you know, tons and tons of people will hear. For her, she writes this music that's kind of a gift to single performers, and they do with it what they want. But her main goal is to create a very special experience for the performer. And I believe I've even heard, you know, people talk about her music where when you watch someone perform her own music, it's the performer is not playing for the public. They are doing this very, very private act that is by themselves and for themselves. And they do this thing that is just, they've totally shaped it for themselves. And when they play it for the public is just privileged to witness this private act. But it's not like I don't know, Beethoven 9, where it's trying to announce itself to the masses and, you know, just give this big statement. It's something totally different than that. And so just to kind of give you an excerpt about what it means to experience her music, this is from a book I highly recommend called Musical Practice as a Form of Life that she wrote. And I'm just going to read a little bit about what it means to experience time and even just perform her music. So this is just a couple paragraphs. "This understanding of time is paradoxical because of the noteworthy duplication. On the one hand, we find this striving towards accurate measurement, towards documentation, and towards classifications of time cycles and periods. And on the other hand, we observe the need for withdrawal or for a suspension of time, as well as the wish to lose oneself in time when the chronometer has does not count anymore. And then she goes on, "Cyprus describes a musical practice that anyone could repeat at any time. With and during this activity, I gain a pause, a place in which to withdraw. I withdraw to an island of time where I can linger freely for a while, protected from the relentless ticking of the clock. The score is an offer, an opportunity for me as a performer to lose myself in light of an acute awareness of time. Any sound could be the last one. The following silence could be a temporary interruption or a final arrival. It remains paradoxical that I can lose myself in time while listening to ephemeral sounds, to fugitive moments. I always resonate, reverberate, and echo the last sounds as I keep playing. I hear, while listening to my own playing, the elapsing of a lifetime. I recognize that I always hear the sound in its very decay. I can hear how I become older. I listen to the constant disappearance of the sounds, but also to the appearance of the next ones. In this way, I also hear my own future death, as Froberger would hear his own death, even if I do not say it in words. You do not have to say it because the music shows it. The performance of this meditation becomes an exercise for the performers in accepting themselves and their lives and the lives of others in humility. It becomes an exercise in affirmation. So the piece I'm going to play you is actually being performed by another person, but it's a piece I played many times. And this performance is very special because it shows, well, one, whenever I've worked with her, we'll have these long emails, but many times I'll ask her, I'll be like, Eva-Maria, in page 10, you write this here. Should I play this louder or should I do this? And she'll always write back with, I don't know, who's to say? It depends on the hall. It depends on the day. It depends on what is going through your head. And she'll never give me an answer. And she'll always frame it in this large, beautiful, having gone through it many times, I realize it is the best thing possible she could ever say to me, because she's making me realize it's not really about like that this is the piece, but she's given me this template for me, the performer, to create something that is unique and personal to me. And so this performance of a piece that she wrote called Nachtstück is really profound because it was performed by a wonderful bass player, Dominic Lash, but he performed it by himself and he happened to have a recording going on, and he's performing it outdoors in a village town called Derbyshire, and he's on a porch. And at first you start to hear the wind around him, and at the very end it starts to rain, and the sounds he's making and the harmonics start to blend in with the nature, and it's a really beautiful performance. So I'm going to play a recording. It's only a fragment. This piece is actually about an hour long, but this is about 5 to maybe 8 minutes of this piece called Nachtstück. Fantastic. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you all so much for listening. And if we have time and it's okay with the SSA, we could open it up to questions.
I have a question.
Yes.
How did you like discover like experimental music, and like so like how did you get into it as opposed to your like original classical track?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's wasn't like I just woke up in the middle of the night and said experimental music, and it was a large part of it had to do with I think, especially going to a performing arts high school, I had a group of friends that were extremely passionate about this music. And it was part of this club we had. And every week, I remember we would just, actually, and there was a professor there as well. There was a teacher, he was the piano teacher at the school. And we would meet once a week for 2 hours. And every week, he would bring in a new piece and show us a new composer. And so it'd be like, okay, this week we're going to be listening to music by Alfred Schnittke. This week we're going to be listening to music by Georgi Ligeti. And, and that really started to open up my mind about what these things were doing. And honestly, at 16 years old, I didn't know half of what was going on. I remember hearing Boulez for the first time and going, like, what the hell is this? This makes no sense. This is just psycho. And but there was a part of me that the like absolute confrontation and the kind of just the fact that it wasn't that it was just weird, that it was that no part of my brain could even wrap around it, my head around it. It was what kind of attracted to me to it, because I was like, this has to be something if it's just this mind-boggling. And so I remember I would take all these recordings home, and I remember listening to the second string quartet of Elliott Carter over and over and over and over and over again. And finally it was just like, oh, there's this logic and this incredible complexity that goes through it. And then I would start writing music and trying to go to as many concerts as possible. But it was this group of friends that were just total weirdos and eccentrics that really helped push me into new music. And also we would improvise a lot together. I remember once a week we'd always get together and be like, okay, we're going to have a trio of double bass, percussion, and this person on like kazoo or something. I don't know. Like, it was just, we'd always put like these random instruments together and just have an improv session where we would improvise for 20 minutes. And that just kind of got my mind going into just doing weird things and creating music. And so that was kind of how I got into it. And then once I went to undergrad, I remember I would just live at the library and check out every score I could. And if I'd even barely heard of their name, I was like, I've heard of this guy named Takemitsu. I need to just sit down and listen to as much Takemitsu as I can. And so that's just how I got into new music. And still today, I do the same thing. I'm always trying to just say, like, just listen to as much new music as I can.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question, Matt.
Yeah.
So when you compose something for someone in particular versus just composing in general, do you have different thoughts that go through your mind when it comes to that, or is it more or less the same?
Yeah, that's a great question. And every composer kind of approaches that differently. I know some composers who there's a composer, Donatoni, in Italy, who died, and he basically, not even for the instrument, he would approach every piece the exact same way, and he would go through a compositional logic and would say, no matter what happens, and this is going to be the piece. I'm not going to think about the performer. I'm just going to go straight ahead with this very rigid logic, which works for him. And then there's composers on the total opposite end with like Elian Radic. I know if the cello professor at UCSD, Charles Curtis, when he works with Eliane Radigue and with these other performers, they go through this intense process where they basically go to her house and live with her for several months. I mean, not live with her, but he'll go over there for hours at a day, and he will just play his cello, and they'll like stare at each other for hours. And it's this like crazy process. And by the very end of it, they've come up with this totally personalized piece that there's no score for it. Doesn't exist. It's all communicated to Charles. Like, okay, try doing this. And after months and months and months, they've come up with this piece that is Charles Curtis. It is his cello. It's this whole like process, and no one else can play it. So I'm trying to show you that there are extremes for how compositions are created. And with me, I don't know. It's, yeah, I try to definitely consider the individuals involved. I try to consider what are their strengths, what is it, how they like to play. I try to consider maybe the concert that it's going in. So that piece for Sandor that I wrote was very, I knew he's a very good bass player. So I tried to write something that was hard and something that would give him a lot to work on. And I knew, but then there's other pieces. My pieces lately have been pieces that, you know, you can sight read immediately, and it's just an opportunity to give people an opportunity to play together. And I say like, oh, here are these three people. And so like the piece, I just wrote a piece for a group in Canada, and I wrote this piece where I knew a couple of the performers, but I really wanted something where the individuals would interact. And so one person plays a tone, and the other answers with another tone, and the other person answers with another tone. And so that situation was based on the type of group, and I just wanted something that gave them a very unique interactive experience. I hope that kind of answered your question.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I actually had a question for when you're conducting, like what is the initial process like for conducting? Like let's say you did the Beethoven 5 for the chamber orchestra, right? Do you know the piece very well? I'm sure like you know most of the pieces you conduct very well anyways. Like, and you know like the general audience, like audience and like who's performing. But, like what is the preparation that goes into like conducting such a massive piece?
Right. Conducting's that's a great question. Conducting can be a tricky one because the conductor never makes a sound, and they don't have they're relying on physical gesture. It is very easy and almost subconsciously tempting to just learn a piece through a recording and just like listen to it over and over and over and over again, and just like, now I know the piece and I can get up and, you know, do my thing. It's a terrible way to learn the piece, honestly. It's, yes, I'll reference recordings, but it's an awful, you just get a very plastic view of what the piece could be. And so I have a process that I go through that I wrote my qualifying exams about this with, and I studied this with Stephen Schick, and it's very much influenced by how he taught me how to prepare for a score. And there's a way that you go through, and it's all about how you mark the score. It's a process that you go through every measure, and you really try to separate, like really understand the score and understand what its logic is. And I have all of these different ways that I mark it that teach me what the piece is. And it's this almost, I try to approach it in a semi-neutral way. Obviously, I know about Beethoven. Obviously, I know this is certain things that Beethoven's about. But the more I can approach a piece as like, okay, this is what I'm looking at it, I can create new paths to go forward with it. So a lot of it is the prep work of how I mark it. Then based on how I mark it and the things that I've learned from it, that will influence my technique and how the gestures I do it. So I'm like, okay, well, here is a pattern of this phrase. So that means that I need to show this in this way, and this is how I need to communicate it to the ensemble. And then that's obviously influenced by, like I know, okay, the chamber orchestra does this particularly well, or this is something they need to work on. So that kind of influences decisions that I'm going to make. Yeah, I hope that kind of briefly answered your question.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, one more question, if you don't mind. what's like, do you feel more pressure when you're conducting or when you're performing yourself?
That's a great question. I don't know if I have an answer for that. I would say they're kind of just different types of intensity. I would say playing double bass can have its own, transparent nature to it, but also conducting, you're in charge of, 60 people, and that takes on a different type of responsibility. I don't know. It's just different types of pressure and intensity. I would say with conducting, there's a type of responsibility that I have, where with solo bass playing, if I'm just representing myself, and maybe it's a totally different thing where I'm within myself. Where we're conducting, I'm with a lot of people. So
Thanks so much.
I have one more question, Matt.
Yeah.
So like, I don't know if you remember, but last year at some point you played this one piece that was like involving singing, or like involved like repeating some like words over and over. Do you remember?
We played it with the chamber orchestra?
No, like I bumped into you at the practice room, and then you like,
Oh!
remember that one?
Yes, by
Okay,
Kenneth Gaburo.
Right. So and I've seen like some other types of those performances, like by other musicians in the music department. So like, if we're trying to listen to a piece like that, like how do we how do we go about like understanding it, or like trying to just like understanding what is going on like in those type of pieces?
Right. Yeah, Gaburo is a tough one, and that is a weird, silly piece. And just to give everyone a background, it's a piece for solo bass where it's written in a way that you speak and play the bass at the same time, but the syllables that you're speaking are supposed to be on the same kind of sonic level, and just like a kind of pointillistic sound that's coming out of your instrument. So you'll hear like a click on the bass, and I'll go da, ba, and it's just all these like, it almost supposed to sound like electronic music. And so a piece like that, it is helpful to have a little bit of background for that piece. And so obviously, if you're just hearing it for the first time, it can be very bizarre and almost nonsensical. But I would say Gaburo is very interested in what he calls, he's just interested in language in general. He's interested in what is language, and musical language. Does sound create its own logic? And so in that piece, he's dissecting the word inside, inside. And so you hear I, it, I, it's just all these, it keeps fragmenting the word to the point where like the word doesn't mean anything, but it also is there, but it's not. And so, and you hear all these other sounds on the bass, and it's for me, what it's supposed to do is create this very abstract sense of melody and gesture, but not in what a typical Mozart way would do. It's just that you hear these sounds in this order and you realize, oh, it's trying to create an abstract phrase. So you'd have something like is, da, ah, and then you would phrase it as ipa, da, kaka, da, ah. And so you hear like a start to the phrase, a middle, and then you hear a resolution. And so this is very odd, but again, the whole piece is creating, it's like, the thing I could almost compare it to is if you've read any James Joyce, where when you read Joyce, if you read something like Finnegan's Wake, the whole book is about the subconscious while it's dreaming. And so half of the sentences are not real sentences. It's not English, it's not anything. It's just he makes up a language, but you as the reader follow some kind of logical syntax, and it starts to make something that you're like, oh, I kind of understand what's going on. It's all these just random syllables smushed together. And so in a similar way, Gaburo is like trying to create this new language based on these like very abstract patterns that go on. that is like a snippet of something we could talk about for 5 hours, but I hope that kind of gave you something.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's pretty interesting that like with the music that the type of music that you guys work on, it involves like playing instrument and also like singing and
Mm-hmm.
like slapping instruments at the same time. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's great. The only downside to that is occasionally it can feel like, you know, being a new music performer, it feels like you do everything. In that, like, I always joke that half the time in new music, I'm not a bass player, I'm a percussionist. You know, you're just, it's just, that's what you are as a percussionist. And occasionally I want to be like, you know, there's people that actually specialize in this that could do this, but no, you definitely have to expand what your technical vocabulary is.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever feel conscious or like self-conscious when you first started like singing and playing at the same time? Because I feel like for a lot of like people who play the instrument, it's like easier for us to just play on our instrument, but it's like harder for us to like sing in front of people because that's not really like something that we do often. So like when you first started out with that, were you like self-conscious of that, like when you first started, like, or like nervous
Mm-hmm.
when doing it or like something like that?
That's a great question. For me, I've always been a fairly extroverted performer, and so sometimes I would give a little too much into just over the top theatrical kind of presentations. So that was never kind of an issue for me. It was always pulling back was the issue. And there was one piece that I did a couple years ago that they called it an opera, but it was for me and a singer but we did this, like, I was in costume and I had to sing, and I actually had to sing in Italian, but it wasn't just like new music kind of pointillistic sounds. Like I had to sing. I remember it was like these full lines of ja, nine foto nine, you know, it was like these long, like it was like in a, you know, a Bellini opera. And that was weird for me. I remember there was a point I remember almost like wanting to yell at the composer, like, this is not what I do. I am not a trained singer. I am trying my best here, but I also don't speak Italian. And I had to spend months getting vocal lessons and learning to speak Italian. None of that made sense. It's all left my brain now. And that was hard. I think the final product was passable, and it was the best I was going to do. And I think at least half the members in the audience goes like, all right, you know, the bass player's doing the best he can. And so it's one of those things that I'm not eager to go back to that project because it's you know, I'm not a trained vocalist. That being said, like in the classical kind of like, here is a leader piece. But the piece that I'm going to be playing by Eva-Maria Houben, she just wrote for me, I actually specifically asked her to write a piece that involved me humming, because this is a totally different experience where the piece is when I hum with my instrument. It has nothing to do with projecting, and it doesn't really have anything to do with giving this la sound. And so when I'm playing, you hear this faint overtone that comes over the bass, and it's just me humming to myself and harmonizing with the instrument. And so she'll have me like hold a low E, and then I'll sing a fifth above it, but it's just, and it's a totally different thing. And although that does make me self-conscious, I feel like it's a more authentic and honest experience, because we all hum, we all sing to ourselves, or at least a lot of us do. And this is not me trying to present a skilled thing. It's trying to present something personal and intimate. Yeah, a good question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Are there any other questions?
Matt, I know this is kind of a huge question, and you did mention a lot of great composers. So I've been trying to, pull up tabs to look into each of them. But if you had to pick like something to get us started with looking at avant-garde music, either a composer or a specific piece just sort of as a hook, where would you recommend we look next after this?
Oh man, that is,
again, sorry for the
yeah. No, it's a big question. I mean, honestly, I would recommend checking out Penderecki's Threnody for Victims of Hiroshima. It's again, you might not even like it, but it's just this like it's a crazy experience to go through. It's just this very wild and frenetic energy, and it's it gives you a very intense but bleak picture, and so that's something I would definitely look into. There's other pieces that I think are wonderful. I know a piece that has been influential for a lot of people. It helps them really experience music but in a very palatable way, is Steve Reich, Music for 18 Musicians. Yes. Or Drumming. That's another one. This is a good introduction to a type of minimalism that for me it's both radical but also not. The problem is it's like, I think these are brilliant masterpieces. The other issue is that all movie music has basically been influenced by it, to the point when you hear it, you're like, yeah, this is just what our culture is now. You hear it, it's saturated everywhere. I mean, you listen to any Hans Zimmer soundtrack and you're like, yep, he clearly listened to Philip Glass at one point. And it again, it's great. It's just, it gets so close to just commercialism to the point I try to tune out, because I'm like, I'd rather do something that tries to go in the opposite direction and not something that's so saturated with like television and just production. But great pieces. I think, put that on one evening and you'll have a great evening with listening to Steve Reich Music for 18 Musicians. But if you get into, again, if we talk about experimental music and things that are just weird and odd, and I don't know, I think of listening to the music of Ligeti can be really intense and powerful. Since you play cello, I would check out the Ligeti Cello Concerto. Weird piece, but amazing. So yeah, very weird piece. I love it. I saw it live once and it was a very powerful experience for me. I'm trying to think of anything else that would, I think listening to free jazz can actually get you more into contemporary music if you really listen to a lot of improvisers, and just start listening to late Miles Davis, start listening to Roscoe Mitchell, start listening to Ornette Coleman. Yeah, Ornette Coleman. Once you start getting these sounds in your ear, it'll really open up. George, I'm just kind of spinning off things, but here's a good piece that is a really just obvious but amazing piece, is George Crumb, Black Angels. It is written for a string quartet that plays electric instruments, and it's crazy. It's wild and just, it's brutal. I'll just say that. Very, very brutal. But great, yeah. I mean, but again, if any of you are interested in more repertoire, I could send you, 5 pages worth of music to listen to. That's not a problem for me.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. This is great. Yeah. This is more than enough music to fill several afternoons.
Great.
Yeah. Ooh, yeah. Cello Sonata.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks, Gabby.
It's a good piece. Early piece, but good piece.